Vienna makes a really good base to go from.
City of music.
Their food scene is so phenomenal, and they've got amazing sommeliers. Start in the bars of Vienna and start a conversation with the sommeliers there, because they will know the really cool places to visit. Go for a weekend, enjoy Vienna, and while you're there, do your research. Speak to sommeliers, speak to restaurateurs, try the different wines, make some of these notes from there. And then in the midweek, get out there and visit these. People tend to have more time, and there's maybe less tourists, and then finish off with Vienna at the end of your trip.
That is such a smart tip. I love that tip, Lawrence, not just for Austria, but anywhere where you can have a base in a city, a cosmopolitan city, and then branch out like Madrid. But it's really a great way to go.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 163. What's the smartest strategy you've never heard of when it comes to visiting any wine region? More specifically, what's the best way to explore the wineries of Washington State or Burgenland in Austria? Why is there such variety and complexity in Gruner Veltliner? And what are the 6 essential stories about wine? You'll hear those stories and more during part 2 of our chat with Lawrence Francis, host of the Interpreting Wine podcast. You don't have to have listened to the first part from last week, but I hope you'll go back if you missed it after you finish this one. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show with the continuing story of publishing my new wine memoir. So for 5 years, I couldn't even look at the notes that I took that became the basis of this book. They were just too painful, too raw, too unprocessed. And I had no intention of writing a book, but I had to get the thoughts ricocheting in my head out somehow. So I wrote them down. It took another 5 years to make sense of them. And it's only when I could pull back through the lens of time that I had any perspective on my story. As author Glennon Doyle said, write from a scar, not an open wound. Writing a memoir for me was like writing about a younger sister rather than myself. I was a different person a decade ago. Of course, we all were. But if I weren't writing about that experience, I know I wouldn't have learned as much as simply just going through it. A few people in my small but mighty beta reading team have asked me how I can even include humor in such a dark story. But that's also the gift of time. If you can see how the absurdity of some things border on hilarity, I think they fit more holistically into your life. Nothing and no one is all good or all bad. And writing about it requires many shades too. My fear that this book could be the one that ruins my reputation for good is less important than its message. I'm all in and I'm doubling down. You'll find a link to a blog post called Diary of a Book Launch, where I share more behind-the-scenes stories about this journey of taking the memoir from idea to publication in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/163. If you want an intimate insider seat beside me on this journey, please let me know if you'd like to become a beta reader and get a sneak peek at the manuscript. Email me at natalie@nataliemclean.com. I'd also love to hear from you if you've discovered a fabulous new wine we should know about, a tip that would help us enjoy wine more, or a question for me. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, a link to the post about the book launch, a full transcript of my conversation with Lawrence, links to his website and podcast, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/163. Okay, on with the show.
So where should we point the jet next? Should we go to Austria? What was Burgenland like?
I'm so happy that you've asked me about Burgenland, actually.
Where is it, first of all, within Austria?
Maybe even where is Austria? Because I think,
Good point.
it's one of those interesting stories, because I think even when I started my journey, I hadn't really done much with Austrian wine. I'd never really been aware of it. It never sort of come up in the conversation. So it was a little bit that, oh, they actually make wine in Austria. And they absolutely do. And they make really fantastic wine, mainly in the east of the country. And yeah, the Vienna airport is sort of northeast. And you head east towards the Hungarian border from there. And yeah, you hit upon all of the wine regions that are sort of in almost like a semicircle lining up alongside the border. And one of those, and I think actually probably the largest of those, is Burgenland. Historically, they've been known for a mixture of wines, really. But yes, like sweet wines and also reds. And I believe their main red planting is Blaufränkisch.
Blaufränkisch, yes. What would you say that's closest to, if you could make any comparison? I know it's a signature grape, it has its own identity, but if we're trying to place that within the spectrum of reds we might be more familiar with, what would you liken it to, roughly?
It's a good question. I mean, I think for me, I always think of it as a more sort of structured grape. Like if you look at it in the glass, it's not so much the purple you see behind me. It's more a sort of a deep, profound, it's got, relatively thick skin, which is where it's sort of getting the color from. So maybe you might want to consider some Cabernet Sauvignons that are handled in a certain way, something that's got a little bit more to it, more depth, I would say.
Yeah, that's a good comparison. Yeah.
I also think the interesting thing as well is that it may be in the producers that I've been going to see that they, again, have been quite sort of delicate with the use of new oak and sort of gone gently in that respect. So you do get that sort of brightness uncovered that maybe you get covered up sometimes with Cabernet Sauvignon if people are using a lot of oak and trying to make something in that sort of way.
Mm-hmm. And were there traditional Austrian dishes or even non-Austrian dishes that you would pair with Blaufränkisch?
Yeah, we're just thinking back now, because on the first visit that I ever did was just to Burgenland and visited a couple of producers down there. The first being Koppich Alexander. They're pretty amazing. They've been making natural wine for 500 years on the site there. And it was lovely.
Low intervention.
Yeah, very low intervention, not a large producer. But Burgenland is actually on the banks of the Lake Neusiedlersee, which is an inland lake, sort of an oval country, which is slimmest east to west, and then it sort of comes a lot longer, a lot skinnier, kind of north to south. We were sat in their home overlooking the Lake Neusiedlersee and trying, I think it was more than 10 different wines. We had maybe 2 or 3 different Blaufränkisch, but the tradition there was always that you'd make lots of different cuvées. You'd always have lots of different wines. You'd always have lots of different grapes there, kind of as a hedge, really, against different, hail coming at different time and grapes that were going to ripen at different times as well. But, it was very, very happy to see, I think, kind of halfway through our tasting, I think just at the time as we'd gotten to the Blaufränkisches, the knife came out, and from memory, it was like a pork knuckle or something like that, and some, I think, pickles, and it was sort of quite hearty food. We were in January time, so that I think was there. So it's again like kind of smoked meats, pickles, and sort of winter produce at the time.
Oh, wow. Okay. And so is Zweitgalt the other red of Austria, or?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't know how popular it is compared to Blaufränkisch.
I think it kind of goes region by region. As I say, I'm pretty sure in Burgenland, Blaufränkisch is king, and I would agree. They're sort of 1 and 2 as the most well-known red varietals that they have over there.
Okay. And then the sort of best-known grape, I think, for Austria is Grüner Veltliner. So did you taste lots of Gruner?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And in Burgenland and in all regions, absolutely. Gruner is everywhere. what's so interesting there is that they explore different ways of making it. So you can get Grüner Veltliners that are really quite simple and they're really kind of zingy, really quite refreshing. Maybe doing a sort of a similar thing to what we spoke about earlier with the Fino and the Manzanillas, you can have them as aperitifs. But then also on that same afternoon, I was lucky enough to go over to another producer called Lichtenberger Gonzalez on a different part of the Lake Neusiedlersee and trying these really complex Grüner Veltliners that have been aged more, they were more premium. They were phenomenal.
What they taste like? Like, how would you describe? Because I think of Gruner as a zesty white wine that's a sommelier darling because it pairs with everything. But what were those aged Gruners tasting like?
I'm laughing because the husband there, Martin Lichtenberger, is a real sort of soil geek. As we were going barrel to barrel, he was very happily telling me, this one was planted on schist soil, or this one was planted on limestone. And so you did get a lot of those characteristics. What I would characterize it as is you turn down the fruit, I would say, and maybe even turning down the aromas, and you just get something that's a lot more complex, picking up more the sort of mineral characteristics. And then I think obviously that's then probably more enjoyable over the course of an evening to then have with your food, with your schnitzel, which is the classic sort of Gruner Veltliner food
Pork
pairing
schnitzel,
over there.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, especially if it's more savory or more minerally. I also get the white pepper, which I love on Gruner Veltliner. I don't know how they get that, but it's so signature to me, at least. That's what pops out. So what sort of tips would you have for people who want to visit Burgenland? Like, where would you start? Where would you go? Other than favorite producers, like how would you plan a visit there?
It's interesting. I mean, I've lucky enough to have been back to Austria, I think around 4 or 5 times since. And Vienna is a really cool city. I would say not even just for Burgenland. I would say Vienna makes a really good base to go from.
It's the city of music, right? There's
city,
so much culture
city music. There. And I would say because their food scene is so phenomenal and they've got, such amazing sommeliers, I would say start in the bars of Vienna and go and start a relationship and start a conversation with the sommeliers there because they will know the really cool places to kind of go and visit. And if I could sort of do it and time were no object, I would do that. I would say go for a weekend, enjoy Vienna, and while you're there, do your research, go around, speak to sommeliers, speak to restaurateurs, try the different wines, make some of these notes from there. And then in the midweek, which is for me is always the best time to get out there and visit these, because people tend to have more time and there's maybe less visitors there that are tourists, and then finish off with Vienna at the end of your trip. So I would say that would be the way to do it if I was going for the first time.
That is such a smart tip. I love that tip, Lawrence. Like not just for Austria, but anywhere where you can have a base in a city, a cosmopolitan city, and then branch out like Madrid. But it's really a great way to go.
100%. And I think there is a wider point there. It's like, obviously, going to all of these places, I've had to do planning before I got there. And it can be difficult to do that planning without context. I've come around now to the view that, really good wine bar or restaurant that really is authentic to the culture, works with the producers, you're going to get them in the capital city. So it might feel kind of unromantic to go and start with the capital city, but then you can always go there, get that base, and then use that as your sort of jumping off point, and maybe even, stay out in the wine country and drive around from there. But I just don't think there's any better way to kind of educate your palate and really kind of get into the culture, making friends with a local sommelier in the big city.
That is great. And I like to, when I go out to the wineries, to ask them, where are your favorite restaurants back in town? So I'll do the flip thing
100%.
Too.
Yeah. I'd imagine it's the same in Canada, right? I imagine.
Yep. Toronto to Niagara. Exactly. I mean, it is more of a 4-hour drive up to the Okanagan, but yeah, absolutely.
Make it like your own personalized tasting just for you. And I think finding those restaurants and doing that little bit of research, you'll find sommeliers who are super knowledgeable, which, most of them are, but I think you'll also find the ones that have got those links, as you say, with the producers and may even be able to make suggestions and may even make some introductions.
Yeah. and say, make sure when you go to this winery, taste this particular wine, or they've got a really interesting tour here, or to really flesh out your experience. But this is a super tip. Thank you for that. So is there anything else you wanted to say about Burgenland? I'd still love to talk about Washington.
I'm blown away, really, when I go back to Austria, because I think, again, it's from memory, they make around 1% of the world's wine. So it's just a splash of wine really being made over there in the big perspective. But the last few years have just been so exciting for me. And I think that the Austrian, I think that now just known as Austrian wine, but the body that does marketing on behalf of the industry, they do a great job of bringing people in from all over the world. So
yes,
when we have these sort of gatherings, I've met people from Canada, met people from the States and China and Hong Kong and Brazil and all over the world. They've kind of got a story to tell because so many of those wines, they pair phenomenally well with Asian cuisine, and they have the full gamut of different whites, different reds, and on the whole, really good quality and quite accessible price-wise as well. So, I think hopefully that's given your listeners some ideas and the confidence really to give some of these what might be new grapes a try. Because I think ultimately I'm known for saying wine is not a spectator sport. Really the best place to discover something new and to find your own new next pairing is to crack that bottle open and to start exploring.
Absolutely. I love that. Wine is not a spectator sport. Whether it's, as you say, trying the wine or visiting the region, just give it a shot. Discover some new pleasures and don't sit on the bleachers. Get in the game. Get in the wine game.
That's it. Get on the pitch.
Exactly. So Washington, I love the fact that you kind of do Netflix series of wine regions. So you'll do 5, 6 or more episodes on a particular region or style of wine. Washington State for you was one of your highest ever listened to series. What really drew people to that? What was it about that particular region or that series that made it so popular?
I worked with the Wines of Washington State at the start of this year, it seems like longer, to essentially bring their brand and the voice of their brand out into the world. Because at that time, they weren't able to travel over to London or to any international market, I believe. And we couldn't travel there. So that was kind of, I guess, the challenge really that they had. Washington State is super interesting for so many different reasons, but I also think it being the second largest wine producing region in the States, I always think that number 2 position is always an interesting one. It's like,
what was the rental car company? We're number 2, we try harder or something.
Yeah.
But California, of course, is number 1, then Washington, then I think Oregon, and then maybe New York State, I think, are the top 4. Yeah.
Absolutely. Spot on. I think just that in and of itself, as you say, we're second, so we try harder. I think that a lot of people out there, maybe more outside of the US, that they either haven't heard of Washington State or they've never tried a Washington State wine and they don't know what to expect. That was a really interesting challenge, was like, okay, how do we get that? Again, I'm Mr. Wine is not a spectator sport. So how do we sort of do that? In the end, it ended up being 3 episodes. My suggestion to them, which I really enjoyed working with them because they were very collaborative, very open to my ideas and suggestions. But my idea was to essentially take a sort of a virtual tour across the state in the company of the winemaker and to draw from them those different stories. That was maybe as well the first series where I really realized and really kind of maybe gave people what they were looking for in terms of I don't need to keep episodes under an hour. I can go, mentioning Netflix, I can go feature length if the conversation allows it. It's never about padding out conversation. But the very first episode of that series was with Juan Munoz Oca, who is the head winemaker at Chateau Saint Michel in Washington State.
Iconic Washington winery.
100%. And we got into some real geeky territory.
Like what? I'm just curious.
We were talking about the Missoula Floods, which I don't know if you've come across. I mean, I hadn't come across them before that conversation. But believe it or not, they are the largest ever movement of water in the history of our planet. And these as you can imagine, colossal forces are actually instrumental in shaping the region and essentially creating this real patchwork, this real mishmash of terroirs. You've got a giant boulder where it shouldn't be, and you've got fossils where they shouldn't be. It's almost like putting the soil into a big washing machine and mixing it all around.
Now, when did this happen, the Missoula Floods? Is this ancient times, or what was it?
Not that long ago. That was a really interesting thing because they essentially unpicked it. And from memory, it was of the sort of order of around 20,000 years ago. But obviously, that predates a lot of the ways that we could record this. And it was actually unpicking that patchwork that, again, didn't make sense. It was like, how did this boulder even get there? And super high level, what they found was that actually there's a town in Missoula. I forget the state that it's in, but it's not actually in Washington state. It's in the bordering state. But they had a massive ice dam there, and that was sort of starting to melt. It would then be a crack. It would be this massive inundation of water that would come down there, flow down what is, I guess, now the Columbia River, and right the way down there through Washington and out into the Pacific and down into Oregon as well. It kind of covered both those areas. But then the dam would kind of refreeze, maybe when there was less water in there. But then the same pattern would happen over several years. And then you had, again, these sort of different layers that were built up by each massive inundation until we're kind of left with what we have now, which again is that complete mismatch, complete patchwork of different terroirs. But it's not a known phenomenon. So it's absolutely fascinating.
All the different soil types, that's got to create some diversity in the wine styles themselves as well.
This is it, yeah. And I remember one particular region that one mentioned, and we actually tasted a wine from there. It's called Red Mountain. The way that he described it to me was, if you imagine kind of almost in the middle of all of this tumultuousness going on there, there's almost like a high point, which was up and out of that. I believe it's one of the smallest AVAs there, if not the smallest, the regions and the kind of stamps that you'll see on your bottle. But just because that was sort of away from that, and I believe it was sort of a predominantly kind of clay face in Red Mountain, that in of itself is completely different from the rest of...
from everything around it. How are they different? Like, what do they taste like compared to what's around them?
So Red Mountain, I believe, is almost entirely Cabernet Sauvignon. And I think it was definitely a kind of a water-retaining soil. Quite big wines that you'll get from there because they've got, kind of well-fed, I guess would be the analogy.
Yeah, the clay would hold the water, yeah.
Exactly. So you've got the water and you've got the nutrients as well. Still very elegant as well. I think that interaction between the soil, the winemaker, the climate, all of these things kind of come together if you want to kind of go there and unpick that. And I would still just say that it was very elegant, the Cabernet Sauvignon that we tried there.
And did anything surprise you about Washington in addition to these Missoula floods and the diversity of the terroirs of the soil types and climates? Did anything else in particular stand out?
For me, they did such a great job of the choice of winemaker. I'm sure this is a question that you asked yourself as well. What makes a good episode? Who makes a good guest? I was asked all of those things and partially data driven, but it was also just, they need to be kind of educators, really. They need to be okay with explaining and unpicking something like the Missoula Floods, which is a massive thing. And I don't believe one is a geologist, but he's a winemaker. He's got his own take to bring on that, and he's got his own lens, which is fascinating to kind of bring to that. And then similarly, cross into the other regions, down into Columbia Valley, cross into Walla Walla, Yakima Valley, exploring all of these other regions, but really getting the word on the ground, people who've got their feet in the soil there. Almost doing what we've been doing today, really, that virtual travel around the region. I did have some of the most surprising wines, maybe ever, were from Walla Walla. They're from a producer called Rheinvan Family Vineyards. And I believe majority of their production is Syrah. They call it a Syrah. They don't call it a Shiraz.
As a nod to the French, the style?
Absolutely. The areas that they were growing these grapes on, it was almost like you couldn't see soil. They were just these huge, I guess you call them riverbed rocks.
Brown stones?
Brown stones that were storing the heat.
Just like the Rhone Valley in France.
Just exactly like the Rhone Valley in France. And they just made these Syrahs that were, again, they were so complex. And I think the flavors that were coming out for me were more like tapenade, they were olive, they were brine, but also this kind of irony, almost blood characteristic, almost like when if you bite your lip by mistake. I think it's one of those interesting things because I think that, if you somebody who's maybe new to wine, they may think that doesn't sound so interesting. How do I sort of get into that? But these are wines that are worth investing the time to kind of try and understand, and really phenomenal.
I loved my visit to Walla Walla. I got a rental car in Seattle. Seattle's a wonderful base camp city, cosmopolitan as well. Get to know your Psalms there. And then I drove across the desert, and, it's this open land of a lot of red soil and some mountains and so on. But after a while, it was like, I think I was driving a couple hours. I hadn't seen a gas station. I thought, I hope nothing goes wrong with this rental car, because it was just drive. But then you get to the Walla Walla region, which is a cute little town too. As you see, these marvelous river stones and these powerhouse wines that still, though, do have elegance and balance. But that is worth a trip. That's a wonderful way, I think. Seattle to Walla Walla would be a terrific journey.
Yeah, no, I'm very, very fortunate that made friends there and have sort of been invited to go and visit. And all of that was done remotely. That was all done with myself in London and the producers there at their winery, kind of at home. I think it's really a really amazing thing, because I'd always said, and I'd always tried to get to the wineries, but I would honestly say, hand on heart, that's the best series that I think I've ever put out there. Almost everything came together. It was almost like that perfect storm, that swirling Missoula flood that put together that perfect soil. It was almost like all of those things. The right people were chosen, the right wines were chosen. We had the ban or the block on travel, so we had tension built into the series as well. Maybe as well, just an interested audience as well. So I absolutely love that series and put it right up there in terms of all the series that I've done.
Our listeners will have to go back and listen to that series and the other series that you've done. Now, I do want to answer the teaser question I asked. And the 6 stories of wine, can you tell us what those are?
Yeah, sure. And I think they'll make sense, around a lot of the things I've spoken about. Maybe the best context for that is actually that idea of wine is not a spectator sport. For me, good wine is a time capsule of so many things, of who made it, of how they made it, where they made it, all of the fantastic things that we've just been talking about there. And for better or for worse, I just find that so often when people are talking about wine, it can be wine brands, magazines, social media, they kind of cut to the chase and they don't build up to any of that time capsule and that context. So I basically have developed this concept of 6 wine stories, and it came out of looking at my back catalogue, really, and focusing in on winemakers and noticing that certain episodes from certain winemakers got repeat listens and had around 100 to 400% higher engagement than the others. And I was like, and there didn't seem to be an identifiable cause for this. But I looked back and I realized, hold on, they're all telling these 6 stories and they're telling them all in depth. And the 6 stories, they all have a really nice symmetry to them as well. So the first story is around people. So it's, meet the winemaker. Who are they? What are they into? What are they kind of like as a person?
Yes, even beyond what they do, like not just the one aspect of winemaking.
Absolutely. And get them talking about themselves. Simple as that may sound, that seems to be a really foreign concept to a lot of wineries out there. We want to know the person behind the wine. We want to know that about so many other things in our lives, so many other foods and products. So we want that with the wine as well. The other thing, and again, I can relate this back to Washington just because we've been speaking about it, is culture. I purposely set out to the winemakers and I said, I want you to talk about other wineries. I want you to talk about the wider scene. I think that sometimes, for whatever reason, people think that they can only talk about themselves, and that actually by talking about the neighbors and the influences that they've had, it somehow distracts from their story. And I personally disagree. I think that it makes the story stronger. It actually forms links with all the other parts of the story. So people, culture. Then there's the stuff we've been talking about earlier in terms of geography. Let's take the little Google Maps man and drop them out there in the middle of the vineyards and in your place. You've been talking about Walla Walla and the stones. Let's look at that. Let's put those in the context as well. Let's give us that visual around 360 degrees of standing out there in the vineyard. Then underpinning that, story number 4 is geology. So it's the stuff that you can't see, but it's absolutely, you might just literally be sitting on the sort of the tip of the iceberg or the tip of the volcano. What is actually under there? What's gone on there? And I think that again can be brought together in a fascinating way and is absolutely relevant for the wine and the geography and often the people as well.
How they were shaped too, not just the vines.
Totally. The 5th story, it's kind of illustrated behind you there in your vineyard scene. So it's effectively everything that happens before harvest. So it's like, again, it's visual, it's visible. It's like, okay, what are you doing out there in January, in March, in April? What are unique challenges maybe thrown up by the geology and geography that influence what you do? So it's getting into more of the hands-on part. And then the 6th and final story, which again is usually quite hidden, is what are the winemakers and what is the team doing after harvest? What is going on there in the cellar? What are the steps, how you get the grapes from the vineyard to the cellar, and what are some of the decisions that you make and you continue to make, and really getting into a little bit the nitty gritty of what goes on in the cellar and usually behind, as I say, those closed doors.
That's great. I love that framing of it. And I can imagine that's why your series have been so successful, because it really gives you a snout to tail kind of the whole package. Because that's actually, like, as I listen to you, and we talked about this on your podcast, it's what I'm going to try to do with the publishing of my memoir. I want to take them behind the scenes, and even go back further, story idea and what it was like to the writing process, and then getting a publisher, and then finally publishing and what happens after that, like the whole story. Because I think people are fascinated by that kind of thing.
I could not agree more. It really sounds like a fascinating memoir. I'll be pre-ordering as soon as we're allowed to. Pre-order, everyone. But again, I think we're getting nosier. We want to know, what is your process of writing the book? And it's maybe becoming a little bit boring to just see the one-dimensional side. Maybe want to know about some of the challenges.
Right. The book lands on the table. The bottle lands on the table. That's not enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who's behind this? Don't just start there. Go back.
100%. The thing that I think often catches people out is, I guess technically there is a 7th story that I haven't spoken about, which is actually what the wine tastes like. And again, if I'm going to say this, I have to be true to it. Wine is not a spectator sport. I don't believe that 7th story around how the wine looks and how it tastes, that is where the focus should be. And in my experience, that is exactly where the focus has been. And those other 6 stories haven't been given the space. They haven't been given the bandwidth. And I, for many reasons, feel as though audio is a really powerful channel to tell those stories. Because again, you don't need to get everything into a TikTok or a 3-second clip. It can be an hour. It can be an hour and a half. And absolutely, because of the medium, because of all of the good things around multitasking and audio literally reaching the parts that many other media can't reach, people will listen, they will engage, and they will take it in, and they will take action based on that, which I think is, ultimately, it's what those wineries need. If they've got that big enough story, then they want people to be enjoying it. And wine is unique. You can get it out there all over the world.
Yeah, and wineries need that connection with consumers or drinkers, listeners, and consumers, listeners want that connection. So
100%.
There you are in the middle, bringing them together.
Matchmaking.
Yes. So tell us, as we wrap up, tell us about your offer. Like, we have lots of people from wineries, wine brands who listen to this. What is it you are offering? Let's regroup on that so that they'll know and want to participate.
Absolutely. So summer was very busy for me, as well as developing the idea of the 6 wine stories. There's also looking into, really taking a step back and kind of saying, okay, how does that fit into a bigger marketing piece? And really found and saw that there are three big problems that not only wine marketers, this is a broader concept, I think that holds up, but absolutely that was, as you said at the start, costing wineries money and costing them attention. And it was that they lacked one or more of the three C's. So the first C being clarity. So the 6 stories kind of sitting under that. And it was like, what makes you different? Why should we buy your wine? Or why should we pick up your wine even from the shelf than another? And I think having those stories underneath and having people really clear on why you're different, that gets you clear. The second was confidence. For me, it shows up, there's just too many wine brands that almost hide behind the bottle. They'll just put pictures of the bottle and they're not doing what we spoke about earlier in terms of putting themselves out there, talking about their challenges and their successes and their ups and downs and really taking people on a journey with them. And then the third C is consistency. I'm the worst person to be talking about this because I've never made wine. But so many times when things get busy at wineries and in regions, then the communication stops and the marketing stops. It's so important to keep that going. Well, once you've got clear on the stories and once you are starting to get confident and get your voice and your face out there, consistency is difficult to fix, but it can absolutely be fixed. And it just means that you're front of mind. You have busy lives. So we always need to be reminded. So what the scorecard does is it tests all three of those 3 C's.
Okay. So they're answering a series of questions and then they'll get some feedback. Yeah.
That's it. It's 15 yes or no questions. On the back of that, they'll be very clear on which of those, if any, they're lacking and that they need to kind of focus in on. And as I say, it's an exclusive offer just for your listeners. I'm very happy to offer a conversation with myself, really, as the person who's developed that model, to just get into it a little bit more, have a conversation and start to diagnose what might be some of the opportunities and some of the challenges that they might be having in getting their word out there. I think it's just particularly sad when you have people that are making fantastic wine and they're maybe not having the success that they could be having, nothing to do with the quality of the wine, but all to do with the quality of that connection that they ultimately have with the person who's going to buy it.
Yeah, awesome. So, Lawrence, they can participate or go through your scorecard at interpretingwine.com/unreserved. And we'll put that link in the show notes for this. So where can we find you online, Lawrence?
Hopefully see you at interpretingwine.com/unreserved. I probably spend most of my time in terms of social media on Instagram, where I'm at Interpreting Wine. I would love, again, you've got obviously podcast listeners and people you've engaged and you have a fantastic relationship with. So also head to interpretingwine.com/listen, which is the sort of entry point really into the podcast. Also, I'll look up and hopefully we can include, I've got some links that take you directly to some of the series that we spoke about. So I've got a special link just for sherry, a special one just for Austrian wine and some of the Spanish coverage that I've been doing. But I can't remember them all off the top of my head.
We'll put them all in the show notes. You send them to me. Yeah, definitely. For people who want to do that Netflix binge on a particular region or...
That's it. That's it.
For sure. That's great, Lawrence. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really appreciate all your tips and your stories. I felt like we were traveling to these different wine regions and you've made me thirsty, so you've done your job. I look forward to staying in touch and chatting with you again in the future because we should reconnect.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah. Someday maybe we'll have the chance to have a glass of wine in person together.
That's it. Fingers are crossed for anyone listening, yeah. Fingers are crossed.
All right. So I will say goodbye for now and look forward to when we connect again.
Okay. Ciao.
Bye.
Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our chat with Lawrence. Here are my takeaways. I love the strategy of starting a wine trip in a base city and talking to sommeliers and restaurant owners about which wineries you should visit. You also get to taste the wines first and determine which houses make the styles you like. 2. I agree with Lawrence about the dazzling array of complexity and flavor in Gruner Veltliner. It's one of the most undervalued white wines in the world and one of the most food-friendly. And 3, I enjoyed listening to Lawrence's essential 6 stories about wine, and especially how wine is not a spectator sport. You gotta get in there, just like life and books. In the show notes, you'll find my email contact, a link to the post, Diary of a Book Launch, the full transcript of my conversation with Lawrence, links to his site and podcast, and how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find the live stream video version of these conversations on Facebook and YouTube Live every Wednesday at 7. That's all in the show notes at nataliemaclean.com/163. Email me if you have a sip tip question or want to be a beta reader of my new book at natalie@nataliemaclean.com. You won't want to miss next week when we chat with Robert Camuto, who has just published a terrific new book called South of Somewhere, Wine, Food, and the Soul of Italy, about the people and places of southern Italy. In the meantime, if you missed episode 79, go back and take a listen. I chat about how Austria's Grüner Veltliner got its groove back with winemaker Heidi Fischer-Pfaffel. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite.
Gruner can be so versatile. You can have a Gruner that's lively and fresh, but you also can find quite rich and full-bodied Gruners that somehow remind you of Chardonnay. We often have tastings of old Grüner Veltliners in comparison to old Burgundy wines, and it's often hard to find the difference.
So they age well because they've got the acidity, which is one of the aging elements.
Yes, but also not all of them are the same. You have some very full-bodied, rich ones that age really well, the reserve styles, but you also have these easy-drinking, lively, fresh Gruners. They are really made for be drunk young.
If you like this episode, please tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the wines we talked about. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a groovy Gruner Veltliner. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemaclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.